so that while folks are joining, we can get some of the housekeeping pieces in. One of these days, I'm going to actually format my these things that I repeatedly put in the chat in a way that they read much better. But for now, I will just put them in via as they are. So for folks that have missed any of our sessions, or maybe you want to return to a particular review that we've completed on any of the patient, practitioner, or even just the approach slides. If you're just joining, you can always find those in our YouTube playlist. So they go up a few hours after each of the sessions. I'm just going to list the playlist now as opposed to them individually, but you can find them there. That's the first link in the chat. I think we shared this last week, but I was just going to repeat it again for anyone that is interested. We had a previous couple sessions ago conversation around where things are moving from a HL7 patient admin perspective around patient relationship and role, because it was one of the items that we had feedback on. So those slides are in the OwnCloud. If you're interested, Joni had presented on kind of the discussion that had happened during the working group meeting and some of the resolutions. So that's the second link. If you are interested in following along to the feedback that we are collecting as a group when we're going through and reviewing the content, that is here. We've got Elliot here today. So what typically happens is I'll display out the content from our Excel sheet on one side of the screen. Elliot has kindly volunteered when he's available to kind of act as scribe so that there's a better separation between kind of the role that I'm playing, which is as the facilitator who is like walking through the profiles, answering questions, like acting in the role as one of the authors of this, so that you folks can react as a community and capture feedback and have the answers that you need to provide that. So what we try to do is a little bit of a split screen where Elliot and others are kind of working in the background and I'm displaying it and helping push things along, but mostly focusing on the actual profile walkthroughs. So if you want to catch up on what has been commented to date, or just follow along as we're kind of constructing the content, you can use that latest link in the chat. It goes to a Google Docs that's public. And as always, what I'll mention is that we are reviewing the CA baseline as a community, but we are reviewing the CA core as a CA baseline community. However, the CA core, the profiles that are put out as part of the 0.1 draft release for ballot are open to individuals, they're open to organizations. If you have opinions that you want to kind of express separately, there's instructions in this first link on how you move forward and providing feedback via the Excel spreadsheet, similar to what we're doing from a community review perspective. The only thing to note is that we did get the extension across the board for the CA core plus ballot period. So that's closing March 8th. So if you do want to weigh in more than what you said before, just keep in mind that there are release periods around when the feedback is being kind of collected to in this cycle. As for today, so we have been reviewing practitioner for the last two sessions and had been focusing on our kind of approach, which is to start by looking at the constraints that are in place between the CA core plus practitioner profile and the CA baseline profile, and seeing like, are there any places where we think there is intentional or unintentional kind of separation or deviates from, and noting that, as well as spending some time looking at the obligations that are part of the CA core plus profile for practitioner. And we previously really spent more time on the identifier and the identifier slices. So we're kind of, if you're in media res with the rest of us, we're looking today at the kind of obligations that remain on some of the other like so telecom name, telecom slices. But we also had an outstanding discussion item that we began last week around whether or not we would want to have any recommendations around the use of should modifiers. So effectively, we've been looking at these obligations in the profiles as kind of you must be able to complete this expectation, but there are other options that we'll go into today. And if the community feels this is feedback that we want to capture, the group wanted to capture it separately from some of the items that we were able to kind of close out and provide like a recommendation on last week. So we could try to have some separation of concerns. So that's kind of what I've got on the agenda for today. Was there any questions for folks before we kind of look back and return to our place within the practitioner profile? All right. So like I mentioned, we've got the feedback on the right-hand side. So last week we were looking at this kind of these identifier can send expectations and specifically around some of the slices that are there. We started to look at like modifying, but before this was kind of closed out, the suggestion to indicate that some of them might be using this should modifier, and the group had asked, you know, can we just spend some time at the beginning looking through what that means and then determining whether or not we actually kind of want to put forward any recommendations around use of this generically or kind of at a use case level. So that's kind of where I'm going to start today in terms of like this should piece. And then once we kind of talk through that and determine, you know, do we want to keep refining this? Do we want to wordsmith it? Then we'll effectively, you know, call for a motion whether or not to pass, and we'll move on to some of the other items on the agenda. So with that in mind, we have been using these things called obligations that have explicit codes that are managed via basically it's an extension that has a value set where these codes come from. And the codes are intended to allow for profilers who are starting to use this kind of more, I would say it's still experimental extension, to convey their expectations in a structured and consistent manner. And it's in part because of the challenges that we had around must supports, where anytime a must support is applied, you know, within a given guide, that guide defines it. So we, and you know, the Canadian baseline or the, you know, Ontarian e-referral or the Swedish base may all have really distinct different meanings for must support. And you had to effectively read those details to understand what the expectation was from a, like what was written from a human language perspective. So these codes are part of what kind of HL7's been proposing to allow for us to have these kind of common patterns to use. And as part of these codes, and you can learn more if you go back to our playlist around kind of the approach that the CA Core Plus profiles have used in selecting the codes that they have. But I'll kind of show you effectively kind of how you can explore these codes themselves and how shall and may and should play into them as modifiers before we get to this piece. So I've opened the extension definition that's currently in the extension registry. We can see we've got this code, which is the thing that really carries the expectation, this structured, consistent expectation that profile authors will use. But there's also things like actors, there's additional documentation and usage. We haven't touched that to date with the CA Core Plus profile. So we're really just looking at the combination of code and actor. If I drill into the value set, which will have all the codes that I'm interested in, I can see, and sometimes I like to actually just drill into the code system in its entirety because you get some additional information here around the use of qualifier codes. But you can see basically there is this structure where you have these modifiers, shall, should, may, and then you also have obligations in this code system. So that would be like can send, will send, use reason, and then all the way down to, you know, other codes that apply more to intermediaries and codes that will apply to receivers. So this was like our no error that we were seeing before. Many of these can be modified with this shall, should, may. And that in effect gives an additional level of granularity to what the strength of your expectation is. So if we look at this kind of can send, so this would be means an application needs to demonstrate during some conformance testing process that there are some conditions under which it populates the element with the correct value. So in the CA Core Plus profiles for patient and practitioner, et cetera, we use a shall can send, which means like there is an underlying expectation that like unequivocally this applies. If we were to use a should can send, I'm just going to give it for this example. What that would mean is we're recommending that an application demonstrates during some conformance process that there are some conditions. This is more of a, like it's an option to consider, but a little bit less strong than a recommendation. But they effectively change how, as profilers that have underlying conformance and system expectations, like the tools that we have to conveying to implementers how strong we're going to be about something. So if I were to apply a should in a lot of cases, the places where this is being discussed is around typically harder constraints. So for example, like we've had some conversations in the international patient access community around should will sends, because the idea is that some of the stronger obligation codes carry expectations for like not just what you're capable of doing, but what you will do in production. So like will send meaning if you have a value for this and you're allowed to share it, you will always share it. So if I was writing a guide where, for instance, I knew it was going to be reused and it might be reused in places where you may not always expect that to carry over as a hard expectation, I might put forward a should modifier on this obligation to tell folks that derive from my profile, you really should consider strengthening this. Like we're trying to push folks to doing this, but we're not going to necessarily, if we were testing IPA, for example, we wouldn't necessarily consider it a failure if we only had a should will send, because typically shoulds aren't held to the same expectations in testing and production than shalls. Now, when we're looking at it from the CA baseline perspective, we've been talking about this with more strict rules. Not the CA baseline, the CA core perspective. We are looking at, a pretty foundational expectation. So demonstrate you are capable of doing this. But, I think when we're looking at how it's been applied, particularly in this space around applying it to certain slices, and maybe some slices that some of them may be more or less difficult to achieve in production. They may be more stretch goals or placeholders. It merits having this conversation about whether or not we should kind of introduce an additional, more flexibility into the approach, for instance. So based on what we've viewed, so we've looked at kind of the modifiers and the relationship to the codes. We talked about can send versus other codes that are in play. Like, what questions do folks have about kind of these modifiers and these codes before returning the kind of conversation about, do we think that this should be put forward as a recommendation for use? No questions? What about opinions? I feel like if I'm recalling the discussion last time, I know, Lorraine, when you were looking at putting a motion in for this request, this piece of feedback, you had wanted to separate out this original information. Is that because kind of you're uncomfortable with the recommendation, or you just want to learn more about it? Are you feeling one way or the other about it, having chatted a little bit about what shoulds versus shalls imply?
I asked for it to be separated out mostly because of the business use cases where we're talking about some kinds of systems just aren't designed to, say, send a billing identifier. So saying should on it, I thought was still stronger than I thought was appropriate in my opinion. So separating it out, let us be a bit more nuanced on what we thought our recommendations are. So applying should modifiers in general might make sense, but in the specific case we were talking about last week, I didn't think it made sense.
And I'll just flip back to the places where, you know, basically we had some slices here that, we knew that CanSend wouldn't be appropriate for, like, because they wouldn't be repeatable, for generic use in across kind of all conditions and use cases. Like, do folks feel like we need to, like, that from a CA baseline community perspective, we need to weigh in on whether or not should gets used as a pattern in the CA core? Are there folks who feel like this would be more helpful than hurtful or more hurtful than helpful? Is there anyone that feels strongly that like we need to provide feedback? Because otherwise, I think like the way that we've kind of treated this is, you know, if there isn't a strong kind of opinion for this to be submitted as feedback, we really haven't been including it.
If we don't provide feedback, does that mean that they won't include the should possibility?
Not necessarily. So I would say, like, when I'm thinking about it as an author, then in the next round, I would prioritize more making sure that the first few, like the things that were explicit requests. So if folks said CanSend is too strong, I would prioritize removal of those CanSends first. And I might hold off on applying should sends unless we heard from other community members, hey, this is actually like, we don't want to lose this capability of recommending. But it doesn't negate our like the CA core's ability to use it if we don't hear it.
Well, and using it in specific use case implementation guides is a little different consideration than using it in the core, where we're trying to address a much broader set of use cases.
Yeah, so to that point, for instance, if in a few cycles we wanted to start using obligations on something like patient summary, we might start up a conversation around, does it make sense to try to apply these kind of shoulds in those places, the ones that kind of carry less conformance expectations, but try to push folks in the right direction. So nothing like we receive in terms of, or we don't receive in terms of feedback excludes the ability to use it in the future. So Elliot, just as kind of acting scribe. So I had basically started capturing information on this in this section. I pulled it down. Like, I think if folks aren't feeling its feedback, we probably don't want it on the sheet, but I'll look to you to see if we think there's another process that we want to go through in terms of like removing it versus keeping it in a backlog somewhere.
I mean, we can put in a comment that this is still evolving. We don't have a consensus on direction here. That, you know, perhaps there is concern about the use, but it isn't, you know, we aren't directly saying we'd like it changed. And I've got a bit of a question about, well, this is something that was introduced, I think introduced in R5, but we're based on R4. And so do we expect systems to actually support it? It's all extension space, so theoretically they can, but whether we actually expect it. So, and it's entirely possible to not give a please do or please don't, but just a, hey, we see this as needing a caution flag. So that's an option.
So like kind of, we think it should be explored further.
Yeah. And the other, or, I mean, just sort of putting out the range of things we could be doing here. There was the question about, well, if we don't say anything, does that mean it stays? Well, if somebody else puts in a comment that it should change and there's nothing that's being heard to the contrary, that feedback will be applied. On the other hand, if there's something we think is good, we say keep it, somebody else says change it, then it gets into a discussion.
Yeah, as far as I can tell so far from what I've looked at, the CA Core Plus hasn't gone into shoulds. And when you're silent, there's shall, right? So they do have some obligations they've listed, but they haven't gone into the nuance of the modifiers yet. I don't know, Sharon, is that an incorrect observation or?
No, so they do have the shall, like if it's hard to see here, but if you're in the JSON, you'll see the shall can send.
But we don't have anything other than shells right now, is that correct?
No. It's just shall can send, shall no error. In terms of a pattern. So Elliot, is there like a way that you would frame we're flagging it as something that needs to be explored further before one way or the other?
Lorraine, sorry, I'm really new to this, and I think it's really interesting considering what we have on our profiles. It seems to me that the should will definitely apply to some of the identifiers that we are using, especially for our patient provider portal, the patient
Yes.
portal.
I think the shoulds will definitely apply in
Yeah,
our registry use case. For
yeah,
those who haven't met Camille, she is an architect on the British Columbia Registries project. So I think they will definitely be useful if we decide to use obligations on our profiles. But whether they belong in the core, that's everyone depends on, is another question. And I think there will be some places where should belong in the core, but not necessarily on the slices we were talking about in terms of identifier.billing, those kinds of things, which drove us to this discussion originally.
okay.
So I don't think in this use case group should make sense, but it might in others. But right now we were sort of trying to come up with feedback as we, in terms of a general approach as we divided things. Like a lot of the more specific constraints definitely belong in specific implementation guides where they might not belong in the core or the baseline.
The way I read the line 16 in your Excel, it say that the should be considered for those that aren't universal across Canada, and yes, definitely then. But then if we are talking about something more like billing, I don't know how we can express that. I don't know. It is yeah. Sorry. First time intervening in this discussion, so it's really abstract for me still. But what I read doesn't. It seems that we were discussing about a use case, and what I read in link 16 doesn't refer to that use case. That's what I'm trying to say.
So I think, Elliot, you started to type in 17. Is it as a replacement for 16 so people can have that comparison point to say like, hey, does this actually make more sense as a statement? Is that right? Or is it additive?
I guess it's additive.
So if it's additive, before we go to 17, what do we need to change about line 16 to make it make more sense or make it be more appropriate for what we actually want? Like, what's the word changes that we should pursue? Or removal, like I'm gonna throw that out, like just because we're talking about word changes doesn't mean we can't strike it out. Talkative bunch, guys. Last week it was like really back and forth about this. So I was kind of expecting folks to kind of come in with opinions one way or the other.
Is it something that people are just having trouble getting their mind around and understanding what it means or what the implications are, and just don't know where to express an opinion?
For me, it's more that I don't know the other use case and what I'm working on. So I can only talk about the registry we are working on. That's why I'm not super vocal.
Yeah, and I already expressed my opinion, so I'm trying to be quiet and let others weigh in.
So maybe I'll give this a straw man to think this through. So if we used a should can send in the core, what that would mean is we're making a recommendation that across all the use cases, this is something that you should consider including and strengthening. So when you have a registry profile, or when you have an e-referral profile, or when you have a patient send profile, that we can't say that systems across the board have to have that from a core perspective, but we're recommending that your implementation consider it and consider strengthening it. And so if we use should, we have to be also in the same vein, very diligent about where we apply that, because our goal is to cover a number of different use cases. So it typically you'd only want to place it on the core, both really any obligation that you feel spans the course of use cases and it's not going to create problems if it's not relevant for you. And
But
so, go ahead.
you were saying that, right, if we don't have the should, then it's a shall, which is stronger.
It's stronger, but it also just means that then we're very, very careful about where we place the shall. So for example, here we had said, that it's a shall can send. Might make sense to say you have to be able to send some type of identifier, but it's not okay to have that on the identifier slices of registration billing. So it just means that you're more rigid about where you apply these rules because they carry a lot more weight.
Just because the core is silent on providing obligations or constraints on an element doesn't mean that use case specific profile can't be stronger. So if it's missing from the core, that doesn't mean that you can't apply it stronger later.
But if it's strong in the core, we cannot lower it.
Exactly.
Correct.
So you couldn't say this actually is a may for me if I had a shall or a should in the core. But Rita, I saw you had your hand up.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was gonna say. Would maybe a may is more appropriate here, because if we flag them as may can send, then you're not saying, all you're saying is that people might be sending this, so you may want to consider sending it if you can, and you may want to be able to handle it if other people send it to you, because it may happen. So you're not forcing anybody to it, but you're adding emphasis to them to say that these things really might show up out there.
What do folks think about kind of may in that instance?
I-
Oh, go ahead, Camille.
No, it makes sense to me, to May.
So one consideration I might just put in, is that one of the things that we think about both in the CA core, and we've talked quite a bit about in the CA baseline, is that the goal is that there is this kind of inheritance over time. And so we try to make statements about things that we know will carry through to any of the more use case specific or jurisdictional specific content. So I tend to like be careful about overstating things in differentials when I'm working on something that I know is going to be leveraged and inherited, because it's additional content that I know gets carried through to my end user. So I typically carry a profile or carry a principle where I'll say, I'm going to make a statement in my differential if I'm going to tell you kind of one way or the other that I think something should be this way. Now, this is a personal principle. Not every profile is that way, but I tend to be a little bit more cautious about applying mays compared to even shoulds when I know the profile I'm applying it to is going to be kind of the parent in a long chain. Just a consideration that like it, when we're thinking about how we might use these in our own projects in the future, there might be a different set of considerations that you're working under.
Yeah, so because mays don't really carry a conformance expectation in terms of the actual conformance testing, they're more useful in the context where you've got a variety of practices and you're trying to gradually drive to a common practice, which is one of the things we did in BC around the CDA implementation guides. We used mays or shoulds depending upon how broadly adoptable, say, a specific value set was, as a way to sort of start gradually moving the community to a consistent place that we were aiming for. So I think that's the kind of case where they're useful, which means like a may is probably less useful in the core, although there might be, I mean, we have a consistent national identifier, for instance, a may to sort of gradually drive adoption might be something to consider. So that was sort of the principle that we used when we were sort of defining those kinds of constraints.
Other opinions, like the other option that we have is that we can continue kind of chewing on this. We have 2 more sessions. This item 16 was always kind of an item that was applied more generically in terms of feedback as opposed to like on practitioner specifically. So we do have things in practitioner that we can spend some time on if we want to chew on this a little bit more. Like we won't call it for a motion or call it for a decision to remove one way or the other if folks want more time. But I don't want to shut off conversation around this if folks kind of want to continue exploring it in this session. Do we feel the same way about 17? Like, do we want more time this was the additive one that Elliot was starting to type in? Or do we want to kind of talk through this one more broadly?
I like the 17.
Sorry, Camille, I heard you, but will you repeat that one more time?
I said that I agree with the 17.
17, okay.
Yep.
Do other folks want to discuss 17 more? Are there changes that we would want to phrase in terms of the way that it's written?
I thought a little bit of way. I just posted a USA Core, sorry, US Core practitioner webpage there. I think we follow the US Core, their pattern. And it might be easier, or may be helpful ourself. Actually, I got lots of idea from this piece of treasure here because you know, that's been introduced, especially the key elements table there is very helpful. So from there, I got quite a lot of idea. So now when we talk about mass support here and the obligation, at which level we should talk about it. And it's a really interesting thing from the CA core right now as an introduction on the simplifier. It's aligned with this so-called, sorry, just short memory. What's the name? Pan-Canadian Health Data Content Framework. It is a framework. And it is framework still under construction for. So CA core should be aligned with this framework, or we need to go new down to such details. As Randy last time mentioned, those kind of a sliced identifier might be useful down the road, but it might not be really need effort and time to talk about today. To stop here. Thank you.
And what I might recommend, Thomas, if there are certain things about this pattern that you like, that like maybe on so March 8th is kind of like our last holdover, like call before submitting the feedback, like bringing those specifically as this is a pattern that I like and I think we should recommend would be, I think, helpful compared to like just kind of scanning it more generally. Is that okay? Like to say, like, if there were things that you want to see and you want to bring out, to call them out specifically and maybe bring them up at next session or the session after when we go over more generic things?
Yeah, and also extra sentence when we talk about this obligation and mass support, may we think about beyond this fire, go to the data model, especially go to this called minimum data set concept, which is actually is the joint called adjacent zone, which is also the input source to feed in this fire. So I think that's the good start point to think about the mass support and the obligation combination. Thank you.
So do we want to continue like trying to progress item 17? Do we think that we can, or do we need more time to talk through it more generically? I heard Camille, you had said you liked it. Were there others that really like it, that feel, you know, confident this is the type of feedback that we'd want to put forward? If not, from a like facilitation standpoint, if folks need to chew on this a little bit, we can do what we did here, which is to say, like, we kind of started on something and we are putting it on the agenda for us to finish one way or the other at a future session. But if we don't have strong opinions one way or the other and folks aren't sure if they need more discussion, I'd be hesitant to close out one of these if folks want more time. Is anyone opposed to me saying, like, return to this conversation like on our March 8th? To go over more broad feedback on approach? Is anyone opposed to me doing that on this one? Okay, we can keep them in the log. There's like, this is a working document. And that will give folks, I think, a little bit more time to think about how they feel one way or the other about it. Outside of this kind of conversation around shall versus should and the approach, we are still looking at kind of the can send, so it would be shall can send and shall no error that's been applied on the elements here. So we've talked about the removal of the can send on these slices, but we haven't talked about name and telecom slices. So want to just give folks a chance to kind of think through in the same vein whether or not we have any kind of concerns or changes or recommendations from the CA baseline perspective that we want to put forward for any of the remaining items that we haven't reviewed. So I'll go to name and telecom in our mappings table below. So we've got provider, so essentially provider, family provider given. And the expectation being applied to being able to express kind of both of these. And I know we've talked about like the mappings previously for some of these, but in our other feedback, but does anyone feel like there's discussion to be had about the expectation for can send, no error on that? What about telecom? So the idea is it's applied to telecom and then also to, the ability to support both phone and email. So can send no error on the phone slice, can send no error on the email slice. So that would be like here and here. Are there systems that maybe only are built to share one or the other of these that we should be thinking about?
Hey Sheridan, I'm thinking about, I guess, drug dispensation records and whether or not you would have practitioner email or phone number attached to the individual who is dispensing a medication. And whether that would even be captured in a system like that, or if it is, or that's even is captured at the organization level and maybe doesn't even apply to practitioner.
That's a good point, Ken. So basically, tell me if I'm interpreting this incorrectly. So by having expectations for our generic practitioner profile, that telecom phone and telecom email be something that systems can demonstrate, that there are some cases where you really just have to have the minimal amount of information on a practitioner that you're referencing, you know, in a clinical resource.
Yeah, I'm wondering if drug pharmacy systems will be an example of that, where they aren't able to even meet the telecom consent.
What do folks think about that? Are there other cases that are like that we want to bring up and say, just like we did for identifier? I think we talked about prescription systems, and there was one other example that we had used when we provided feedback. Even if there's not more than one, like would your suggestion be that we should change something because of that statement? You might, yep.
Yes, I think in that case, maybe it would be a should consent rather than a shall. Or maybe we even do what we did similar to identifier, move the elements from up to telecom rather than at the more specific phone number and email site.
Do you have a preference on which way, just so that Elliot can kind of capture and start to frame that as a piece of feedback?
Not particularly. No, I don't have a preference either way. I'm just really hoping to then through some discussion or comments from some of the other folks on the call
Yeah.
that make more a social lens on in this case.
Is there anyone who feels like, even though that might be the case for some systems, that we should be pushing for like the ability for the systems that are referring to a practitioner to have the capability of expressing these telecom details?
I agree with Ken. I think it should be.
Oh, I can hear you very, very quietly, Rita.
It's Camille.
Oh, sorry, Camille. Sorry.
No
Go ahead.
worry. I agree with Ken. I think it should be a should as well.
I also think that there are instances where the practitioner telephone doesn't necessarily apply all the time. It's not the same phone number all the time. So it would be more in the practitioner role that you would look for the telephone number and the email address and all the contact information. So forcing it to be in the practitioner resource might not be a good thing in all instances.
Yes, I think, for instance, in our case, a college of physicians doesn't always know a correct telephone number for the physician that they send us.
Yeah.
So
if you look at the CPSO, sorry, exactly. If you look at the CPSO listings on the web, there's absolutely never any telephone, or unless it's associated with a role, like a hospital role or a clinic role, in which case it would be the clinic phone number.
Even that I heard actually, just use case when we talk about if we need to have a practitioner to be incorporated in the profile, and there's quite a lot of concerns from the practitioner community. Say, why should have those information included?
So do we feel like we need more discussion, or do we feel like someone is confident about what they would recommend for this level of expectation for telecom and its slices?
And so I think I'm confident that we don't need to have a can send on those.
Okay. Elliot, do you have that on your end, or I can type it?
No.
Are
Not yet.
there any systems where they would be expecting a telecom associated with the practitioner? Right, like the can send would be there to accommodate systems that are expecting it at the practitioner level, not at the practitioner role level, right?
So you're saying independent of, it's like the scenario where it just wouldn't come through for the use case. Are there ones that would expect it in practitioner over practitioner role?
Right. Like, are there systems that might not use practitioner role and might just use practitioner?
Yeah, well, practitioner role covers a practitioner in a specific, setting, location, clinic, pharmacy, as opposed to a more generic contact information. So in the BC registries, the values that are in practitioner come from the colleges where they create the base information, and that's the contact information that the college has for that person. And that person might give a home contact number. That's where they want the college to reach them. But for clinical uses, if you want to contact someone at a clinic who made a prescription, for instance, and clarify the prescription, that contact information ends up at the practitioner role. Now, other systems may look at things differently, but I sort of agree with Rita. I don't know that at the core level, we want CanSens on. Now, saying that I'm on specific slices, back to my comments on identifier, I could be convinced that we might want a CanSen on telecom in general, but not specify a specific slice. I don't know. I don't have good sense for the use cases broadly or core.
But I just feel like I don't think we should eliminate the CanSend because, you know, we have limited representation on this call. We don't have very much in the way of vendors. We don't have all of the jurisdictions. So we could be like cutting a jurisdiction off at the knees if they don't use practitioner role.
We don't have a CanSend. That doesn't mean you can't send. Right? CanSend says everybody who uses this profile is going to have, if they're going to claim performance, is going to have to write code to be able to send the particular item that we put a CanSend obligation on.
Yeah, but I'm just saying, like, there might be vendors that are expecting it, and you know, a jurisdiction might say, oh, well, I don't have to send it, so I'm not going to. And then the vendors are expecting it, they're not getting it because it's coming in on practitioner role, which they're not using, and now they don't have any telephone
I don't
information.
think we can solve that.
So the other way of looking at it is, if it's in practitioner role, then it shouldn't be a challenge to copy it over into practitioner in order to participate in one of our, you know, in an environment that's using CA Core.
Although there's often multiple contact informations in practitioner role for a given practitioner. A given practitioner might have multiple roles in different environments.
Yeah. So you're suggesting that practitioner may not have any phone numbers because the 4 different phone numbers that we do have for them are all associated with specific roles.
Exactly.
Like, I just think we would need more eyes on this before making a recommendation to take off the CanSend.
Do you mean like
Theoretically
independent of
more-
should or may or anything like that, Joni?
But theoretically, Joni, other people have eyes on this in terms of their reviews.
Yeah.
We're looking at it from the point of view of baseline some things, right?
Yeah.
So do we feel like, and the way that it's written out on the screen is on a particular slice, right? That it's on specifically phone number. That there is a portion of this, like it on one slice or the other, or an expression that we do feel confident on. That, because I've heard some folks like feel like this is what they'd recommend. I've heard some hesitancy around kind of getting the viewpoints, but you know, if it is something that we're saying there are some portion of this that we agree on and want to put feedback in for, I think we should try to work towards that. So for what Elliot has, which is relaxed practitioner telecom phone number from CanSend, it's just showing as some system here. I don't know why it's not wrapping. May store this information. Are there pieces of this that people are uncomfortable with that we should modify or further discuss kind of before like we take a motion one way or the other?
Yeah, I just feel like we're assuming the use of practitioner role when we're relaxing that.
So then is there another lens to this outside of the practitioner role for why we might see can send on phone number as too strong. So I think, Ken, you started off with the example of like a drug use case. Is the scenario you provided because it's being stored in practitioner role or because it's not being conveyed at all?
I think just possibly may not be captured at that level, or not even be able to be provided at that level.
Yeah. I think in BC we don't always have that information.
And the reason I ask is because, you know, the way it's written assumes practitioner role, but I think we've heard some perspectives also that like that just revolve around its use entirely in as a referred resource. So what do folks want to do?
I don't, I think if we can rephrase and saying that may store this information in practitioner role or in other location,
Or
in
not.
other, or not at all, yeah, even.
I mean, actually, is there a way to do an invariant that it's, can you do it, can send if practitioner role doesn't exist?
Well, does that get around that? Does that address the or not at all portion?
I'm not sure.
I don't think an invariant would address that particular component. If this was some systems may store this information in practitioner role and others may not send it at all. I think the invariant probably wouldn't address this, but what I would say would be if we thought there were some cases where it was more common, then I would apply the expectation at the use case level. I'll expand this so you folks can see it too. Perfect. So Elliot's updated it to relax practitioner.kelecom on phone number from CanSend, as some systems may store this information in practitioner role and some may not have this information where the practitioner is a secondary to the record. So pharmacy systems was the example. Investigate whether cross-resource invariants are an option for the first issue, must be practitioner role. You threaded the needle on that one. So what do folks think? Does this need more refinements? Do we feel like it needs more discussion, or would someone be comfortable kind of motioning it for it?
I'm good motioning this.
Is there anyone that feels actually, I should say, just
What's
with
the
respect to the
motion?
process, was there further discussion that's needed? And to Lorraine's point, what is the motion? So Rita, can you be explicit when you're motioning? Are you referring to this as it is phrased currently?
The phrasing's probably okay. I think the crux of it is that we want to relax the can send. And we're trying to give some justification as to why.
Now, do we want to, when we say we want to relax it, do we want to remove it or relax it to some other value?
Well, you'd relax it to a may send.
So I am going to take that as maybe this needs a little bit more wordsmithing about where we want this to be, especially because it's the top of the hour. Are folks, anyone uncomfortable starting on this one first thing next session on the 1st?
Sounds good.
Okay. All right, then we'll keep it. I'll just note as a return to.
Don't type anything.
Oh, it's too late. I'll stop typing. I put return
Hit
to.
escape.
Escape. Okay.
All right, now you can go ahead.
Now I can type.
Yeah.
Okay. And we're into, no, it'd be 3-1.
Yeah.
I will
That's
see you
crazy.
guys next month
It
officially,
feels like Christmas was yesterday.
right? So I'll stop sharing. I'll put the recording up and I will see many of you soon.
Great,
Thanks much.
thank
Cheers.
you. Sheridan, can you hold for 1 sec?
I can for
you.
1 second, but I can't
Okay.
for much more than that. 1 second. Let me just stop the recording.